Remember the Forgotten.
Chapter 11. An Eye for an Eye. Caked in dry mud and exhausted from their travel, Aurora and Zircon arrived at the Flowering Blade just as the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky painted an ocean blue and illuminated by the gleaming rays of a full moon. A warm yellow glow poured from the windows as they approached the front door of the inn, welcoming them in after a tiring journey. Despite it, however, Aurora couldn't help but sigh as they did, frustrated that after 2 days of confusion and exhaustion, they had ended up right back where they had started. Together, they pushed open the double doors and stepped inside. The clerk still sat in his chair, the scene almost identical to their first visit, save for the fresh vase of flowers planted on the desk and the far thicker book the man was reading. We're looking for a woman who might have stayed here, Aurora said to him, cutting right to the chase as she closed the gap between them and determinedly placed her hands on the counter. The man arched an eyebrow in response, his eyes drawing away from the book and peering at Aurora through rounded spectacles. After a moment, he huffed, placing down his book and turning on his chair to face her. And who might this woman be? He asked, retrieving a leather-bound ledger from beneath the desk and flipping through it. Zircon watched Aurora expectantly as she began to rack her brains for clear memory. Well, I didn't get a great look, she admitted. She had dark hair and was wearing a cloak. This was a couple of days ago. Pondered the clerk, stroking his chin. I'm afraid I can't say I've seen her then. It's been a quiet week too, so I remember the guests we've had quite well. Aurora slapped the desk in frustration. Zircon sighing to himself as he leaned tiredly against the wall. Well, I guess there's not much we can do, figured Zircon, as the pair left the building dejectedly, returning out into the chilly night air. At least we tried, I suppose. We can't give up that quickly, Aurora protested, lips pursed and shaking her head. She then perked up slightly as her gaze tilted towards the side of the building, where Zircon had first been attacked. Maybe we can examine the area around where it happened. If she went off into the woods, there might be tracks. Zircon followed Aurora around the side of the inn and back to the spot where he remembered waking up without a clue of his past. The grass was still trodden and trampled from the scuffle, but little else stood out to him. He sighed deeply and looked around blankly at the horizon, the dimming light beginning to bring out the stars again. If she had gone out to the roads, I would have seen her leaving, Aurora theorised. So, if she went into the woods, which way would she go? Zircon watched her as she looked around, deep in thought. He was surprised that she could still keep going like that. He didn't know why, but it felt so unnatural to him. Truly, he was in awe of her. She disappeared so quickly, speed must have been a priority. That in mind, I doubt she crossed the road. Aurora's gaze panned across the road and the forest on the other side of it, and she nodded in agreement with herself. So she must have gone vaguely this way. She began walking back towards the darkness of the forest behind the inn, weighing up the various directions the woman could possibly have escaped into. Then she turned to Zircon. I bet if we explore a little, we'll find some sort of trail. Now? He questioned, widely eyeing the ever-growing darkness around them. I don't think that's a good idea. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that we'll lose her, Aurora argued, looking to her companion pleadingly, with a smile that betrayed her excitement. Zircon stared into the trees. The forest looked oh so dark, but Aurora's enthusiasm seemed almost to shine a light through the gloom, a light that, despite himself, he felt he wanted to follow. Summoning all of his resolve, he pursed his lips and nodded to her. You're right, he said. We can do this. Aurora beamed at him and stepped closer. The two shared a brief look before they took a collective breath and stepped slowly into the foreboding shadows. Now under the cover of the trees, the pair spread out amongst the wooded ground to gain a greater view while they searched deeper and deeper, scouring amongst trees and bushes for any semblance of a trail to follow. Darkness blanketed the forest, as if purposely trying to cover up what they sought to find, and time continued to pass onwards, with them discovering nothing at all definitive. As the last vestiges of twilight began to fade from the night sky, it felt to Aurora as if she was already bound to fail. That was until, by herself searching through one area of the gloom, she heard Zircon suddenly let out a yelp from somewhere nearby. She sprinted through the darkness, running through rustling bushes and pushing past branches, until she finally found him, shaking as he backed away from a dark silhouette on the ground. "Aurora, it's..." he stammered, pointing weakly to the thing. Aurora didn't move at first, her heart beating faster as she observed the silhouette's familiar, demonic figure, barely illuminated by a sliver of emerging moonlight. Just like the thing she had seen grappling Zircon out the window of the inn, it had a grey, stone-like body and two horrid horns protruding from its grimly shaped head. It was lying face down, its details barely perceivable in the darkness, but Aurora was nonetheless certain that it was the same creature. She stepped forward, not saying a word as she approached the thing, and slowly reached out with her foot to nudge it. The creature rocked side to side slightly as she applied the pressure, causing her to jump back, but it did not move. Not by itself, anyhow. It's a statue. Stepping forward again with slightly more courage, she cautiously pushed the creature's side until the monstrously heavy thing finally rolled over onto its front. Her and Zircon both jumped back as its creepy visage became visible finally. It did, by all appearances, indeed seem to be nothing more than a statue. The kind you'd find standing guard outside a mansion or a graveyard, clearly carved by someone with a strange concept of beauty. I don't understand, muttered Aurora, furrowing her brow. This is definitely the thing that grabbed you, yet it's... Did it die? Zircon offered, kneeling down to get closer to the creature without having to approach. That depends on whether or not it was ever actually alive, replied Aurora. I suppose if it's a magical creature, it might have been deactivated? Zircon swallowed audibly. Does that mean the woman we're after is a sorcerer? Surely we can't consider still trying to take on someone with that sort of power. She only caught you unawares before because she had this thing, Aurora told him, gesturing to the dead-still stone body on the ground with a renewed confidence. Now it's the two of us. I know that we can do it. Zircon opened his mouth to protest again, but somehow he didn't quite know what to say. Hang on, Aurora then said as she began to back away from the thing on the ground. Looking around the woods, she continued. If it was still walking when it fell over, then... The curious woman stared at the statue's head and followed the direction it faced with her eyes, carving a mental path through the forest and then pointing where it led her. It must have been headed that way, she finished, not so subtly smiling to herself with satisfaction. Watching Aurora's excitement at having found a way, Zircon tried his very best to be brave. The pair stalked ever further through the woods carefully. The passing of time seemed to fade away in the silence as the dim and distant lingerings of sunlight disappeared completely and left the trees shrouded in immense darkness. The further they went, the harder it seemed to get to avoid stepping on dry leaves and twigs, trip over roots, or even walk into trees completely. Aurora allowed herself a stifled laugh the first time Zircon walked headfirst into a spindly sapling, but he was far too on edge for such things. They continued to walk and walk for what must have been hours, until, suddenly, Aurora stopped. Do you see something? Asked Zircon, turning to look at her. Shh, Aurora replied. I see a fire. Following the path of her eyes, Zircon quickly noticed the distant orange glow filtering through the trees, like a loose lamplight with nowhere to go. That must be her, continued Aurora. There's no reason for anyone else to be out here. Let's move closer and get a better look. Zircon felt his fear returning. Faced with the approaching reality of the situation, they planned to tackle a sorcerer head on with not even a weapon. Are you sure this is a good idea? He whispered. It's not too late to turn back. We found her, right? I'd call that a success. But Aurora had already begun to sneak forward through the trees. Aurora! Zircon called again, but she was not listening. Forced to swallow his fear, he reluctantly made to follow her, holding the tail of his cloak in his arms so as to avoid it scraping against the leaves. The two moved onwards, further and further, becoming steadily closer to the flickering fire which provided ever more clarity to the shadowy forest around them. When Aurora finally stopped moving, she was leaning out from behind a tree, stealthily peeking at the scene unfolding before her. Zircon, meanwhile, ducked low behind a small collection of shrubs slightly further behind, narrowing his eyes as he followed her gaze. The roaring fire in the centre of the small clearing before them burned upwards, funneling towards the sky in an almost unnatural shape. There was no wood at the bottom, no flickering embers. It seemed as if it was burning from nothing at all. Not far from it, Zircon saw a strange woman, wearing a dark cloak, firelight licking up her back as she faced outward towards the dark forest. Her hood was down, giving him a clear look at her long, crazed black hair and her strong-featured face. Although he had no memory of her, she yet seemed familiar to Zircon, like out of a dream he'd never had. She seemed youthful on the surface, yet something in her demeanour didn't quite sit right. It was like she had lived a long life, and yet somehow not truly lived at all. Strangest of all, the woman was holding a bright round gem outwards in front of her towards the forest, as if offering it to the night itself. That's her, right, Aurora? He whispered loudly. Yeah, she quickly confirmed, but what's she doing? Zircon leaned in slightly closer, trying to see what she could possibly be facing in the endless darkness that was these woods. Right then, he began to hear it. A faint sound, but one getting closer. Like the crunching of leaves, but no, it wasn't just that. It was accompanied by a rhythmic thump, a rumble, almost a small earthquake that Zircon could barely feel in the tips of his fingers. Do you hear that? He asked, leaning towards Aurora. She put her ear out and listened. For the first time, Zircon could just about see hints of anxiety on her starkly lit face. What is that? Listening in closer, Zircon swore he could hear twigs. No, whole branches snapping with every intermittent cacophony. Crash, 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 crash. He examined the rhythm carefully. Were those footsteps? On second thoughts, Zircon began, weakly laughing to disguise his terror. She can have my memories, but I'm sure they weren't that important anyway. Let's go back. Aurora did not respond. Zircon could hear and feel the source of the noise getting closer by the second, moving towards the clearing and the strange woman. She, however, remained standing still where she was, either oblivious or simply uncaring, holding out the gem towards the sound's approach. Was she waiting for it? Aurora, Zircon whispered urgently. The noise is getting far too close, enough that he could now feel the ground shaking beneath his feet and see the leaves bouncing on the far edge of the clearing. His friend did not respond, and Zircon found himself frozen in fear and anticipation as he finally began to see a dark shadow moving within the trees. The seconds ticked away, and he started to feel the foreboding presence in his deepest soul, certain that the moment was afoot. Aurora, we need to go, he shouted, but turning to look, he found her no longer there. He searched frantically through the trees, his eyes darting around manically, until he finally spotted her up ahead, running straight into the clearing. Aurora! He shouted. He went to run, but his foot caught the edge of his cloak, sending him tumbling to the ground in a crash of leaves. Fear staining his visage, he stood up and ran, holding his cloak close so as to not trip again. He dashed in between the trees, narrowly avoiding collisions as his shoulders scraped across the harsh bark. He sprinted forward in a panic, tempering his anxieties as he broke through the trees and into the clearing, not far behind his companion. By this point, Aurora was upon the woman, and Zircon could only watch as she snatched the gem from the stranger's hand in one smooth motion and began to dash forward to the cover of the trees on the other side. As she did, the woman's face contorted into a look of shock, and then quickly into one of pure, unfettered rage. She reached out with an open hand, aimed pointedly at Aurora, muttering an unintelligible incantation lost under the sounds of the heavy crashing just within the trees. Suddenly, light began to jutter and erupt from her hand, like a trapped flash of lightning fighting to escape a storm cloud. Without even thinking, Zircon ran forward and leapt at the woman, jumping onto her back and knocking her off balance just as she let the energy loose. A cackle of blue electricity lit up the forest in a terrifying glow for but an instant as the spell soared through the air at an immense speed, then impacting the ground just behind Aurora and scattering a flurry of earth and flaming leaves into the air. Zircon and the sorceress both fell to the ground in a heap, her hands immediately glowing once more as she reached out to try and grasp her unseen attacker. While she was still disoriented, Zircon rolled out of the way and scrambled to his feet, picking up a handful of dried leaves, which he threw at the woman's face just as she began to stand. He bounded away from her towards the trees, far too afraid to even look back. That was when another crash, far louder than any of the previous, resounded throughout the clearing. Whatever that thing was that had been so long approaching, it had now finally broken free of the trees. When Zircon reached the edge of the clearing, he couldn't help himself but to turn his head and look back. His eyes widened in terror. The thing emerging from the trees was easily 3 times Zircon's height. His body was vaguely humanoid, but its face, if it could be considered such, was totally alien. It had only one eye, bright red and seeming to burn in the light of the fire. Zircon saw its huge muscles, gristly, falling and rising in places simply not right. He looked for Aurora. She too was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at this creature, but she was closer to it, much closer. The sorceress had finally got to her feet, wild hair covering most of her face as her hands once again began to glow, this time with a dreadful red aura that seemed to radiate pain. Her hair flew out of the way of her eyes as if it had a life of its own, revealing the terrifying rage on her face. However, just as she was about to take a step towards Aurora, she finally noticed the creature steadily approaching from the edge of the clearing. The woman froze for a moment, before suddenly backing away a few steps. Her eyes stared widely at the creature, and her furious snarl seemed to quiver at the sight. The creature continued to step forward. The crazed woman then turned to Aurora, as if desperate to reach her, but in the moment it seemed like her fury was overtaken by fear. With one final glare of pure hatred towards the frozen Zircon through her almost glowing dark green eyes, she hurried her retreat from the creature and swiftly disappeared into the darkness of the woodland on the other side, so silently it was as if she was never there. Zircon and Aurora were left alone with the lumbering monster. Zircon couldn't move. He watched in paralysing fear as this beast, this thing so ferocious that even a sorcerer would flee in terror, slowly turned its head towards Aurora. As she stepped slowly back from the terrifying thing, expecting its stillness to break at any moment, it turned its head again and stared instead towards Zircon. Then it looked to the sky, and finally back into the darkness in the direction the sorceress had fled in. Its lumbering footsteps finally began again, and it continued its terrible journey after her. Aurora and Zircon watched in stillness as it walked slowly and destructively into the forest, its towering shoulders effortlessly breaking through the branches until it finally disappeared from their sight. As their fear slowly waned, the two began to move towards each other, still cautious as to the danger in the woods. When they eventually stood side by side, Zircon's breath was heavy, while Aurora's was still held. They were both terrified, yet, as they looked at each other, they couldn't help but start to grin. Without needing to speak, the two began together to hurriedly move away from the oppressive clearing. "That was amazing!" Aurora exclaimed as she finally released her breath. the two now having moved a safe distance from the clearing and its fire, and being only lightly basked in the moonlight filtering through the trees. Yeah, it was, Zircon wheezed in reply, only half forcing the smile appearing on his face. Aurora leant back limply against a tree as she succumbed to exhaustion. Grinning still, she pushed through it just enough to hold up the strange red gem in her hand, doing her best to examine it in the dim light. I wonder what the hell this thing is. Zircon coughed as he continued to try and catch his breath. I don't have a clue. Then Aurora's eyes widened, and she stood suddenly and jarringly, her body seeming to ignore the exhaustion in favour of something more scary. She turned to Zircon, her face grave, and said in a fearful, muttery voice, I've forgotten things. Zircon looked at her, furrowing his brow. What things? I don't... She stammered, grabbing her head. I'm missing so many memories. It feels like my mind's gone through a sieve. Zircon swallowed hard as he began to understand, fighting the trembling in his hands while he stepped towards her in a calming gesture. Don't panic, he stuttered. Did you look into the gem? I didn't, Aurora shouted back, choking back tears. I was careful, I was. Zircon swallowed hard again. Do you remember who I am? Of course I do. Aurora's voice was fierce with rising emotion, frustration, fear. With each word, though, that energy was quickly waning, leaving her with little left but sadness. I remember the last few days mostly fine, she croaked, water glistening in her eyes, but everything before, it's so patchy. She looked down at the ground, tears flowing down her face and fists shaking as she tried to hold in the wave of emotions flooding through her. Zircon stepped forward slowly, hesitantly, unsure quite what to do or say. His own body still vibrated from the unfamiliar stress of the situation, but he stifled it, calmed himself, so that he could lean forward and slowly wrap Aurora in a gentle hug. It's okay, he told her, trying not to sound as worried as he was, while the darkness and the rustling leaves of the forest began to feel more and more unsettling to him. We'll sort this out. I know we will. That's what you told me back at the tavern, right? Aurora did not move, did not speak. Whether she was fighting an internal battle, working through her feelings, or trying with all her might to force herself to remember, Zircon did not know. But she did not resist his hug, leaning against him as her legs became weak. Zircon had no clue what his name was. He had forgotten. He couldn't tell her. He daren't. His mind quietly raced through the events of the last few days, the only ones he could remember living. They were, thankfully, mostly intact, but he could not deny the fact that something was very wrong. He could not remember the view from his manor, nor the voices of the guards in Hillmaven. He had forgotten the face of the innkeeper at the flowering... He was suddenly drawn back into the present, as Aurora tightened her grip around him, clinging on as if for dear life. The pair stood like that for minutes, owls occasionally hooting in the distance as the night grew more and more full. Eventually, just as Zircon was prepared to spend the whole night like that, Aurora finally released him from her grasp and straightened up, wiping the tears from her eyes. Zircon let go of her and stepped back, anxiously awaiting what she would say next. We need to look into the gem, she stated, voice almost devoid of emotion. Zircon took a moment, but then nodded in agreement, reaching out and taking the gem from her without resistance. I'll do it, he told her. Zircon went to lift the gem up in front of his face, not wanting to give himself time to hesitate, but Aurora grabbed his wrist and interrupted him. Wait, she said, finally looking up, eyes red but no longer tearful. Instead, she looked worried. What if you forget everything again? She spoke softly and quietly now, tired but very aware. I'm not sure I could handle that. For a moment, Zircon could do little but stare at her. Look, he eventually spoke, reaching out and taking hold of her hands as he breathed out heavily. These last few days have been weird, but even though I can't remember any of my other days, I'm certain that these ones have been the best of my life. I don't want to lose them either. But if this gem is our only hope, this will be what makes sense of it all. I'm certain of it. Are you sure? Asked Aurora, her eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. Zircon nodded. I am. The two's eyes met softly, still for many moments, until Aurora finally stepped forward and kissed him. It was a small kiss, passionate but short-lived. It felt almost like a farewell. As she stepped back, the two once again basked in the silence of the forest. A smile on his face, Zircon nodded one last time, and then brought the gem up to sit right in front of his eyes. He stared into the red gemstone as it shined gently, even in the darkness, stared right into its centre. As he did, his eyes widened. Aurora watched anxiously as he stood there, gormless and unmoving. Then, after too long a moment, he blinked rapidly, and suddenly, then slowly, lowered the gem down from his face. Aurora stared into his wide eyes, almost afraid to hear what he would say next. When the silence remained, she had no choice but to break it. Zircon?